Do you guys know Yuzu, the Nintendo Switch emulator that allows you to basically run Switch games on your PC that just recently got banned? It just got killed by Nintendo. See here, if you try to click on Yuzu's website, it's kind of sad. It just loads. It doesn't exist anymore. It's just gone. Why did it get killed by Nintendo? It is actually because so many people were actually playing Tears of the Kingdom, so the Legend of Zelda game, on PC. But why did people want to run Tears of the Kingdom on PC? Probably one of the main reasons is to make it look and run better. If you see here, I mean, the Nintendo Switch is just so underpowered nowadays. This is a video from Digital Foundry running at 30 FPS. And to a lot of people nowadays, and I don't blame people, 30 FPS isn't that good of an experience. This is what got me really thinking, is like the Switch is running at 30 FPS locked. This is a live FPS counter. You see this FPS graph here? It is a solid line at 30. Why does it run at 30 when maybe at sometimes on the Switch it could run higher than 30? Why doesn't Nintendo allow the FPS to go further than that if it is possible? Because usually more FPS equals better, right? Well, it even got me more curious because so many console games out there are always locked at 60 FPS or 30 FPS, and rarely we've seen them locked at 45, but it's usually like pick one, 30 or 60. But why do they choose to lock the FPS? Do they know something that we don't? Because typically when we think of FPS, the higher the better. You know, you get as much FPS you're gonna get. It's gonna make your game look smoother. It's gonna make it more responsive. That's why we buy faster CPUs, faster RAM, faster GPU. On PC, it's the whole advantage of PC is being able to up your FPS further than what consoles can do. But are consoles actually onto something that we're not doing? Because surprisingly, limiting your FPS in games through a bunch of testing I did can actually be really good. Okay, we're in a Last of Us Part 1 here. And you can see I'm on a very fast GPU right now. I'm on the 4070 Ti Super. So yeah, this can handle a lot of FPS. I'm on a separate PC, so this is entirely like, this is running as fast as it can go. Ultra settings, fully at 1440p. And then you can see here we're at native resolution, 110 FPS on average, which is really high. It's super smooth, really nothing to complain about. You probably wouldn't even want to change in this game, but this is really just to show you what is possible. If you see here in the corner of the screen, if I point that way, there's a little thing called LAT, and that stands for latency. And you can see we're getting about 13 to 14 milliseconds of latency. Now we'll go into a little bit more of how this is tied into how fast the frame rate is a little bit later in the video, but latency is super important because it's how tight is your game going to feel? How responsive is your input in the real world into the screen that you're looking at? Let's go ahead and cap our frame rate. And this can seem really unintuitive because we were getting 110 FPS and that's really good, but let's cap our frame rate to 90 and see what happens. By capping our frame rates, getting less frame rate in the game, that we're getting better latency. And, you know, we capped it to 90 FPS. I mean, the game still feels really smooth. We're at 9 milliseconds now, or a little bit under that a lot of the time. I'm not gonna like sit here and say like, oh, you need every millisecond of latency in The Last of Us Part 1. We were already at a very good base frame rate and a really good base latency, but it gives you an idea of how much things can actually change. So let's also check out if we just cap it by more. This might surprise you a lot. Let's cap it all the way to 60 FPS. What you're gonna see is our latency is at 9 milliseconds. 9. It is still less than when we were running at 110 FPS. And you guys can't see this. The game does visually look less smooth to me, but you're watching a 60 FPS video, so it's gonna look the same to you. Capping your frame rate can make the game feel really responsive. Now, it is pretty important when you run at these frame rate caps to get the best latency that you need to be at the peak frame or get capped at 60. Like, you don't want to be going under 60 or whatever you cap your frames to. You want to be hanging around right at that cap all the time to get the best latency. I'll just show you an example of, so let's say we're getting 110 FPS before, and you would think the latency would be good, but because we're not always running at 110 FPS, we're actually a little under it there. But if we maybe look at the sky, then we'll get 110 FPS and our latency will be good. You see we're at 6.4 here. because we're frame rate capped at 110, it knows how many frames are going to the CPU and the GPU. But then if we look forward here and we're getting less than 110, you can see our latency spikes up a lot. So you want to cap your frame rate right about where you can actually maintain steady FPS and where the game visually looks smooth. Like 60 FPS, I mean, it's generally agreed that the game does look quite smooth. And this actually might be one of the reasons. There's actually been a push recently in PC gaming to be getting more than 60 FPS. People want this 114 FPS average of latency, but really when you cap the frame rate, the game is going to feel more responsive at lower. So why does the frame rate cap actually help the system latency? And that's because the CPU and the GPU are becoming in sync. When your game is GPU limited, see we're in Last of Us Part 1 here, which is very GPU intensive. So I mean, it's also CPU intensive, but I have a very fast CPU in here. Especially when you're GPU limited in your system, the CPU is like pumping out frames, right? It's working faster than the GPU is working. Every single frame that the GPU renders is already previously rendered on the CPU. I'm showing some stuff from Gamers Nexus here because they collaborated with Nvidia here to do sort of like a latency demonstration. When the CPU is pumping out frames faster than the GPU, it ends up getting sent to this thing called a render queue as it waits for the GPU to finish up its frames. But every frame that's waiting in the render queue is technically where the game should be. And that means that all those frames are adding latency to your game, because once you actually visually see the frame rendered out by your GPU, there's already other things that have happened in the game. Now, when we cap our frame rate in game, now the CPU and GPU, they know how many frames to expect. And it actually makes that render queue kind of obsolete. And that's where we're gonna jump into another technology that isn't in this game, but it's in another game. Okay, we're in Cyberpunk here. What I wanted to check out in this game is specifically because it has a technology called Nvidia Reflex. Now, you guys probably heard about Nvidia Reflex before because it is Nvidia's technology that reduces latency, okay? Sometimes it can be great, sometimes it doesn't work as well. You can also see average PC latency as well. You can only use average PC latency with the Nvidia app software when you actually have DLSS 3 available in the game, so that's why I didn't show it in the other one. But by average out the frame rates, we're getting about 93 to 95 average FPS, and we're getting about 18 milliseconds on the render latency and about 41 milliseconds on the average PC latency. Go ahead and just turn on Nvidia Reflex. And what you're going to notice is instead of limiting our frame rate stays relatively the same. Sometimes it'll go down a little bit, but most of the time it'll actually be pretty stable. But you can see that our render latency dropped from around 17 milliseconds to 12. And then the average PC latency dropped from, what was that, almost 40 to like 27. Our overall numbers dropped quite a bit. Let's go ahead and check out the other setting that Nvidia Reflex does have to offer, and that is on plus boost. Kind of the same. We're getting about the same latency. We got a little bit lower, not by much, so it actually seems almost more inconsistent. Now let's go ahead and just check it out by capping our frame rate. What's something important to note is our frame rate didn't change that significantly using Nvidia Reflex, but let's go ahead and cap our frames at, let's just do this at 80 FPS, something that we could probably maintain. Our overall PC latency is actually a little bit higher than it was with Reflex, but our render latency is lower. What's interesting now is our frame rate is locked. We're getting a pretty tight, pretty smooth experience. Now we can also look at what happens if we cap our frame rate all the way at, obviously we were getting 90 FPS. We can obviously hold a stable 60 FPS. Our average PC latency is around the same as it was before, but the thing about it is our overall consistency in the gameplay is probably going to be more like consistent. Consistent is more consistent. It's because we're always getting 60 FPS. We know what latency to expect when we're playing the game, and we're probably not going to drop while we're playing it either. But you're probably wondering is like, well, how does Nvidia Reflex work? You're able to get that good latency while maintaining a higher FPS. And it is a very, very good technology because Reflex allows you to do that. And then, well, basically what it is a dynamic frame rate limiter. Calculates how long it takes the GPU to render out a frame, and then basically lines up the CPU to only prepare a frame for the GPU every single time the GPU is ready. So it basically marries both the GPU and the CPU together. That's so they're in sync when they're processing frames. Sometimes maybe the GPU is less consistent, and then the CPU doesn't expect the right amount of frames. That's where your frame rate could take a dip using Reflex, but overall you're still going to maintain really high frame rates while getting better latency, because now that render queue doesn't really exist. But something I just wanted to test out, you know, for shits and giggles in Cyberpunk here, ray tracing overdrive, and let's just set it to DLSS balanced at 1440p. This is maxed out ray tracing, and just see what kind of FPS we can hit. Getting around the mid 60s on FPS here. Very fast card, so it is able to do this. This is very demanding. So what you can see here is our latency without any kind of reduction technique is pretty bad. 50 milliseconds of latency on the average PC, and I'm not gonna lie, it doesn't feel that tight, especially because the 60 FPS frame rate isn't that consistent. Sometimes it's better, sometimes it's worse. When it gets better, when you have higher frame rate, then your latency is going to decrease and actually feel tighter because there's less time in between the frames. Obviously, we do have reflex in this game, so we could just turn off our frame rate cap and turn on reflex, and we'll get better latency. So if you have access to reflex technology, they can be a great tool. We're going to get into AMD cards a little bit later in this video. But yeah, reflex is a great technology, but capping your frame rate, I will say, is definitely an alternative. So like, say we're capping at 50 FPS. That sounds, as a PC gamer, capping at 50 FPS, but it's not 60. Yeah, maybe you would technically want to cap it at 60, and maybe you could always go to DLSS performance so you maintain 60 FPS. But something else I wanted to show you too, if you are capping your frame rate to reduce latency, you know, you're going to be sacrificing a little bit of smoothness to make the latency better in your game, because the more frames you have running in the game, the smoother it's going to appear and all that stuff. I do think DLSS performance looks pretty soft here at 1440p. It doesn't look terrible, but it does look pretty soft. If you're in like a single player game and it doesn't really matter about, like, you know, seeing every single frame perfectly, then you could turn on something like motion blur, and that does make up a lot. Like, to me, the game looks so much smoother with motion blur on it. And yeah, obviously we're locking our frame rate at 60, and we have full path tracing on in the game with DLSS performance right now. Getting good latency without reflex on or anything right now is just really good experience. Again, when people talk about, like, you know, 60 FPS isn't good enough, are they talking about the game doesn't look smooth enough, or are they talking about that the latency isn't good enough in the game? And that's where capping your frame rate, getting a solid 60 FPS could be really good. 60 FPS is not dead. I mean, eventually we're going to always want higher and higher frame rates, but it's clearly not dead. But let's go ahead and hop into a competitive game just to check it out there, where latency matters a lot, because it actually gives you competitive advantage if you can see somebody peeking around a corner, you know, before the opponent could see you. So actually having a faster refresh rate monitor, having faster peripherals that, you know, respond faster to your movements, like faster render times in your game, does affect your competitive advantage. You can see people and kill them before they can kill you. We're cranking a ton of FPS here. We're at 1440p on native at medium settings, so it's pretty low settings for this GPU and everything in this resolution. Latencies are pretty good. I mean, overall PC latency is only 10 milliseconds. Our frame time on the graph there is only 2 milliseconds, so maybe we can improve that latency by turning on some different settings. Now, this game does feature reflex and stuff like that, but can we do this without being so inefficient? Because to me, it almost feels like a waste of how much frames that we're pumping out. We can't even see them. So is there a way to optimize this to make it more responsive while not having our GPU work so hard or our CPU work so hard? First off, let's just go ahead and check out Nvidia Reflex. Just enable it in the settings here. Because we are GPU, or actually CPU limited in this game, running at, like, you know, 480 FPS or whatever, or 90 FPS. Nvidia Reflex relies on us being GPU limited. The CPU needs to know how long the GPU takes to render a frame. So we're not seeing this insanely big improvement in PC latency. We were at about 10 milliseconds before, and now we're at about 9 or a little under 9 at times. So I don't think most people can notice that. Some people can. Some people claim they can. I don't think most people would. So let's also check the Nvidia Reflex plus boost. As our frame rate does go down a lot. We dropped from like 490 FPS to 450, but our latency also decreased a lot. Now our render latency in the game is about the same, but our average PC latency dropped from 10 before we turned on Reflex to 5 reflex on plus boost. Now, a lot of people actually would be able to feel 5 milliseconds of latency. I'm playing this on 120 hertz refresh rate right now. Let's go ahead and drop this down to 240 hertz as the frame rate cap and see what happens. What you do see, which is absolutely bizarre, we cut our frame rate in less than half, or we went from 490 to 240. It's a little bit less than half. We're actually getting a better latency. Now the render latency is about the same, 9 milliseconds of latency. So we dropped like a millisecond there. Now you're not going to be able to see that, but what's really interesting is you look at the top, our GPU is only working at less than 50% of what it needs to do. Our CPU is barely working too. So this can make your system a lot more efficient, especially like if you're just chilling out playing a game. Why do you need to draw a whole bunch of power? Like my system overall is drawing like 200 watts right now. It's like, it's pretty low amount of power. But you can also do another thing in this game. This won't be available in every game, but some games have this little setting here. Let me hide my camera. That is actually called reduce buffering. And if you turn on reduce buffering, I'm not exactly sure what it does, but it does affect your latency. Which is pretty cool. What you can see is we now, without using reflex technology at all, so you could do this on any brand of GPU, we'll check that out in a little bit. We now dropped our render latency down from, what is it, like 3 milliseconds or so down to 2, and our average PC latency is in the mid 5 to 6 milliseconds of latency. And that is actually something that you'd feel. And we're running at 240 hertz, like our system is barely working compared to what it was doing before. Your latency isn't gonna vary a whole lot. I mean, you're locked at 240 FPS, which means that you're not gonna like have swings in latency as you're playing the game. Like one time it's more responsive, one time it isn't as responsive. Like what if you can't maintain 240 FPS? Well, in a game like Overwatch 2 here, we actually have a thing called dynamic resolution scale. It dynamically is going to change what resolution your game is running at in order to target a frame rate. And this is our frame rate that we're targeting, 240 FPS. If your game were to drop below that target frame rate, then it's going to decrease the render resolution of the game and then upscale it in order to maintain the look of the game while not impacting your FPS a whole lot. Is now at like 5.66 milliseconds of latency, extremely consistent. And even if some crazy stuff was happening in the game, your latency wouldn't change a whole lot because the resolution scale will compensate for it. So you're getting this insanely consistent and responsive experience. You could basically get the entire advantage of Nvidia Reflex, like making your gameplay even more consistent. Now this does take a little bit of tinkering. Again, like I said, Nvidia Reflex being a one-click solution is really, really good and really, really powerful. But having a very consistent and responsive experience, especially in a competitive game, is extremely strong. It gives you literally a competitive advantage. You can kill people before they can even see you. There's still a skill gap there. Like, just because you have a fast monitor and you optimize all your latency settings, yes, it's going to give you an edge, but you still got to be good at the game. I'm sorry, I'm not that good at the game, so I'm talking from experience. I'm not a god. So let's go ahead and check out how you can use frame rate caps on AMD GPUs as well. And I bet you're wondering, is like, okay, what is the difference between AMD and Nvidia in terms of latency? Well, Nvidia has been on top of the game of latency because of reflex technology, which we looked at, but also AMD has made attempts to catch up as of recently. And in terms of graphics and stuff, you can actually turn on this little feature called anti-lag, which does help to reduce input lag, but it also doesn't really have an FPS hit or anything like that. So you might as well just turn it on. AMD did make another competitor, and that is called Antilag Plus. And I'm on the wrong PC. 1 second. Antilag Plus. But they did it in a way where you don't actually integrate it into the games, because Nvidia's technology is essential to be integrated into the game so that the game engine knows how fast the GPU is rendering, how fast the CPU is rendering, how to manage that render queue, how to eliminate it, and that kind of stuff. Instead, what we're going to do is mod the game. And guess what happens when you mod the game? You get banned. And the games that are most important for latency. Like other games, yes, visually demanding ones could be important for latency. Anti-lag plus, because you modded the game in Counter-Strike 2, people were getting banned for using anti-lag plus. They did kind of resolve this. Everybody who got banned because of it did get unbanned, but AMD hasn't really recovered from this since. And to this day, Antilag Plus isn't on their GPUs anymore. They removed them so people would stop getting banned accidentally and stuff. And this feature did come out in 2023. They're saying that it's going to kind of come back. I have no clue how they're going to do it because they're still going to be modding the games apparently. There is an advantage to AMD taking the approach of modding the games because Nvidia has to work with developers in order to integrate Reflex technology into games. That's why Reflex isn't in every game. Basically, the AMD developers can just figure out how to put it in the game and then mod it into it instead of having to work with the devs and everything. It's like AMD can do it all on their side of it. Devs might not like that, which I wouldn't even blame them for not liking this. Basically modding the game. Some games aren't meant to be modded and stuff like that. Now let's check out AMD's ways to reduce latency because Antilag Plus isn't really a thing, right? So how do we reduce latency? We're in Cyberpunk here, and I have to use this overlay in the top left because it's the only way I can measure latency on AMD cards. What I'm gonna do is also enable this, and now I'm gonna enlarge it. And you can see it does show the GPU percentage and stuff like that. You wanna mostly be focusing on this number here that says the milliseconds. That is PC latency. We're getting 50 milliseconds of latency at 1440p Ultra. And we don't have any frame rate limiters or anything like that. So let's just turn on anti-lag right here. And you can actually turn it on without having to reopen the game. You can see we just dropped from 50 to like 30. That is actually a huge difference. Okay, and that is without any input from the game engine. I don't know how they're doing that. That is very effective though. Say for example, you're in a case where you try anti-lag and it just doesn't work that well. So anti-lag's off right now. We're at like 50 milliseconds of latency and the game is like, feels okay. 85 FPS. Well, let's see if we frame limit the game to 70 and what kind of difference it's going to make for us. To now around 35 milliseconds of latency on average. What is nice about it too is it is consistent. So we're actually consistently getting 70 FPS. So this is just like a global way you can reduce latency. It's not specific to the GPU brand. We're actually at ultra settings at 1440p on the 7800 XT. No resolution scaling or anything. You can see that we're getting about, 310 FPS or so, about 16 milliseconds of PC latency. Now, I'm not sure if you'll always be able to use Frameview. I will leave a link to Frameview, the tool I'm using to actually see latency here. I think it only works in games that has DLSS 3 available in it, that you'll actually be able to see that on an AMD card. Even though you're not using DLSS, you need to have it available in the game because it's how Nvidia works with the latency pipeline, I think. I know we're using an Nvidia software to monitor an AMD card, but it is what it is. It is what it is. It's a tool that works. So let's see what happens if we mess with a few things. So first of all, we could actually set the FPS cap because we can hit 240 FPS pretty consistently. So let's just try capping at 240. What happens? Our latency improves dramatically. We drop from literally like 16, 17 milliseconds of latency all the way down to like 8.5 milliseconds of latency. Oh, it just dipped into 7. Wow. Uncapping the frame rate. What's interesting too is you do see our GPU doesn't have to work as hard. We're at like 80% load as we're at 100% load before, but we're actually getting better latency. But what happens if we drop the settings down in the game? Is it better to just cap your frame rates and not even drop the settings in your game? 400 FPS in the game, and you can actually see our latency was lower by capping our frame rate at 240 instead of this. Let's go ahead and cap it. Now we could cap it at 360, you know what I mean? We could cap it higher because the settings are lower, and then our latency is going to be even better because we're at a higher frame rate. And now we're getting like 6 milliseconds of latency. So just by capping our frame rate, we pretty much cut the latency in half, which is absolutely incredible. And I just realized my face cam has been off, but I've been looking at the camera and I haven't even been actually shown on the screen. And then all the same things apply like with the Nvidia GPU is like we can always use dynamic resolution scaling. We can always do that kind of stuff to maintain that target FPS. And in this game, like FSR 2.2. So yeah, we have available anything that we'd want to use it for. But like seriously, frame rate is always something that we target, and we always want as high a frame rate as we can possibly get. But we found out today is like, yeah, frame rate capping, it actually does make sense. It does provide a more consistent experience. It does provide lower latency, even compared to higher frame rates, because the CPU, the GPU, they know what's going down. You know, they can talk, they can communicate, they know what's up. Allows your system to be at as low latency as possible. And at the same time, frame caps can make your system more efficient in terms of like power efficiency or noise, heat, you know, that type of stuff. You know, especially like maybe you're in the summer and it's really hot in your room or whatever, you can turn on a frame rate cap to reduce the heat in your room. How do you do it? What we saw is you actually do want to have a frame rate counter on the screen or something to see what kind of frame rate you can get, and maybe tweak your settings in the game to get a decent amount of FPS that you would be okay with capping at. So say you're getting 65 FPS. Maybe you want to turn down settings in the game so you could be achieving 70 FPS consistently so that you won't dip below 60 where you actually cap it. And that will give you the best latency in the game and also make your system just more efficient. It does take a little bit of manual tuning. That's why the latency tools like Reflex and Antilag Plus, when it does come around, are very, very good tools. Just click one button and you pretty much get the best latency you can most of the time while maintaining that higher frame rate. Now, what is the major downside of capping your frame rate? I think it's kind of obvious, is you're sacrificing smoothness for latency. If the game is running smooth enough, you know, even if you turn on, people might hate me for this, but you turn on a little motion blur, it could actually look really good. But it just depends on personal preference. How high is the refresh rate of your monitor? But a lot of times I would say if you're able to lock 60 FPS in the game, it's still gonna feel pretty damn good. There's a huge crowd of people out there fighting for GPUs to be pushing past 90 or something like that, or the 90 is the new 60. I don't think that's really entirely true. As long as you have a rock solid 60 and it's capped, it looks really good. A little bit of motion blur too really smooths it out. Then in competitive games, even frame rate caps are still a good thing. Like, it makes your system more efficient. Like, you can still get insanely good latency performance while being a lot more efficient, and you don't even see the frames. Like, say I'm playing on 120 hertz here, like why would I need 400 FPS when I'm not getting a latency benefit from it? And I could just cap it at a much lower frame rate. It's really some things to consider, but capping your frame rate can surprisingly be very good. Definitely answer that question, at least for me, hopefully for you too, why frame rates are always capped in games. I was like, why do they do that? Why don't they just let the frame rate run as wild as possible? But hope you learned something today. And I'm going to see you guys in the next one. Peace.